would start, so I know the first time I showed up to one of these office hours, it was because I wanted someone to fix my Mixpanel problem, and I had no idea who the speaker was, and I stuck around and was happy to hear what they had. But I thought I'd start with what is Betterment, in case you arrived here without knowing that. So Betterment is a lot of things. Sometimes when I ask friends or when I hear employees describe what is Betterment, you get an answer somewhere along the lines of, well, you know, it's that investing app, right? And so we're actually a lot of things, and so it helps to give context to sort of like the different roles that we play when you think about what our users are and what their problems are and how we try to figure those out. So we're a registered investment advisor, which means we give financial advice. We're a broker-dealer, which means we trade those assets for you. We're also a B2B 401k provider, so we provide the 401k system and experience to companies who want to give their employees a good 401k experience. We're also a white-labeled advisor platform, so if you're a financial advisor and you want to serve your clients on all their interesting problems but not deal with all the nonsense of their trades and whatnot, you can use Betterment as your platform and provide your service that way. We're also a human advisor referral network. So when we get customers in the door who say, this whole website situation is great, I love your technology, but I just don't feel confident doing this by myself, we can refer you out to a financial advisor who gets our system, gets our philosophy, and wants to add that human touch. But we're also a tech company, right? So in this space, what's interesting is that all these services have been provided for decades, right? And what makes us different at it, what makes the solutions that we find in this space different, is that we're founded as a tech company. We solve things the way that a tech company does. And that leads us to sort of a different kind of product than has existed before. And then finally, we are a robo-advisor, which is a word that means almost nothing, but is the one that is most commonly associated with what Betterment is and what we do. And then we are all of those things with a mission. So we try to step back periodically and say, how is this thing that we sort of find ourselves wanting to do furthering this general mission, which is to empower people to do what's best for their money so they can live better. At the end of the day, we're not building an app that we want you to have to use every day, or that we want you to sort of even spend any time thinking about at all. Ideally, you get to Betterment, you do the things that you need to do, and you check back every once in a while to change to reflect the things that have changed in your life, or to change with new information you have about yourself. But really, we want to build a product that lets you do everything else in the world. So that's what we try to measure ourselves against. A little bit more detail on a few of those steps, the big pieces. So Betterment, the investment advisor, what that means is you create a Betterment account, you show up at the app the first day, and we ask you, okay, what are you trying to accomplish? Why do you want money, right? Usually it's, I want to retire someday, I want to buy a house someday before that, I think I might have kids that want to go to college someday, and if I lose my job, I would like to have a bucket of money so I don't get homeless too quickly. Right? Most people have some variation of those combinations of financial needs, and the app, and when I say app, I mean the web app, but also the mobile app, right? You can do this wherever you want. What it does is gives you advice both on how you should save for that goal and how you should invest, right? So we tell you, if you're going to need $3 million to retire, don't worry, those are like $20, $55. Here's how much you should start saving now, and here's a portfolio that's appropriate for that time horizon, the amount of risk you're comfortable with, right? We ask you questions that you know how to answer, and then drive you directly to the actions that you know how to take. And then we're also a broker-dealer, so you don't have to be both, right? You can give someone financial advice, and then say, now go over to E-Trade and buy these Vanguard tickers, right? So we do the second step too, which is, now that we've told you you should be in a 90% stocks portfolio, we'll buy those ETFs for you, and we'll manage that portfolio over time. So when it pays dividends, you don't have to remember to like check your account every once in a while and reinvest those. When stocks go way up and bonds don't, and your portfolio gets out of whack, you don't have to worry about every quarter or every year buying or selling the things to keep yourself where you want to be risk-wise. We'll do that for you automatically. And then all of the fancy tax things, that's really sort of investing philosophy-wise. We don't try to beat the market, right? We don't try to say that we know what's going to happen next quarter, or we know that what Trump is going to do to the stock market, right? Because most of the research has suggested that for the vast majority of people, that's a bad promise to make, right? And that as investors, you really shouldn't For the vast majority of people, that's not an appropriate approach to trying to invest and to accumulate wealth. What we do is a lot of, we know that you're going to have to pay taxes, and so we'll do the things that are most efficient around that set of rules. And we can do a lot of things because we're using technology that rich people have always gotten to do, but have been fairly inaccessible as strategies to most investors for a long time. So that's what we do as a broker-dealer. We get all that money in the places that it should be. And then just a quick view, Betterment for Business and Betterment for Advisors. When you're a Betterment for Business client, what you are is you're the HR person or the benefits person at a company, and it's your job to get all your employees set up with their 401k, answer their questions about their deferral rate and all that stuff. So we have a different app that's for those people that helps those people run that system and help all of those employees be effective savers. And then for advisors, this is an advisor view where you see all your different clients, right? And you see how they're investing and what new goals they've set up and all those things. I bring this up because from a user event tracking perspective, plan managers have a totally different world of goals and needs and events to track than customers do, and a totally different world than advisors do. So we have all of these worlds instrumented, and we're asking questions about how they're all using the app and what we can save for them. In these B2B businesses, it's usually not about making an app that's easier to find what you want. It's about making it fewer clicks to get that job done that you have to do 50 times a day. Right? So it's a different set of design criteria and a different set of analytical questions. And then finally, Betterment the Robo-Advisor. If you ever read an article about us, it will start with a picture of a sci-fi robot. Guaranteed. And so it cracks us up that every article starts like that. What that has come to represent in the market is this new generation that's probably more appropriately called fintech, right? This is a more general description of the idea that these services that have been provided for a long time are changing and becoming more accessible now that people are taking a tech approach to them. Usually what people think when they hear robo-advisors is that we're running little market-beating hedge funds for every customer out there, right? Which is not at all what our business is doing. Our business is taking a tax-efficient, customized investment strategy for each person and doing it very efficiently so that we can provide it to more people and for a lower cost. Okay, and then just quick facts. Betterment has had people on the platform since 2010, so we're not probably quite as new as when you first heard of us, if you have. We're right here in New York City, a mere 8 blocks up 6th Avenue. So if you work here, or if you're here often and you're curious about Betterment anyway, we do lunches on Wednesday and Friday. Come on by, let me know. We are 220 people now. About 100 of those are in the last year, so we've been growing quickly in size, adding floors all the time. We're up to $8 billion in assets and 230,000 customers, 300 plan sponsors for 401ks, 300 advisory firms. All 4 of those bottom numbers, well, these 3 are all roughly double a year ago, and there's about 100,000 new customers since a year ago, to give you a sense of growth. Questions about Betterment and what it is before I start explaining a lot of detailed things about how we're doing data? Get any sort of like base level confusion out of the way now? No, okay. So then we're all enthusiasts of this event data, right, and measuring what's happening in our apps and what our customers are doing. So I just want to sort of highlight which things Betterment uses event data for. So it's things you're familiar with, acquisition funnels, feature engagement, also things that are pretty specific to us, initiating a rollover or setting up an auto deposit, right? Those transactions intents. So when someone initiates a rollover, it might be 30 days before we get the money from that rollover, but we sure would like to start counting it now, right? And so we use our user event layer as our layer of intent. It's the money that we expect to see. Sometimes it'll be tomorrow, right, if it's one of the faster versions of transfer, and sometimes it might be quite a while. Also for sort of navigation and experience, where people are spending their time in the app. Across platforms, so we use Mixpanel in our web, mobile web, Android, and iOS environments. And as I mentioned, we also use it across different kinds of users. Customer service agents, 401k plan managers, advisors. That first one I didn't mention before. Our internal applications, our customer service applications are wired up with Mixpanel so that we can tell how long it takes our customer service agents to resolve cases, right? How long does it take them to find this customer and pull up their information, all that stuff. We use it there too. Same approaches. So I thought for this talk, one of the things that makes me enthusiastic about this space is I feel like we've gotten much, much better at using Mixpanel in the last couple of years. We used to say, I love Mixpanel, but I feel like we're so bad at doing it that I never know how to figure out what to make of this and that, right? And it was not because Mixpanel was not doing its job. It was because Mixpanel was like the first analytics tool that we'd ever used, and so it grew up with this history of that first engineer who did a bunch of stuff his way, and then everything after that. So in the last year, we've done a lot of cleaning up and a lot of sort of best practices development, and we figured out how to make user event tracking sort of a discipline at Betterment that our engineers sort of know how we do things and what the process is and what's a good job of doing this stuff. So some of those topics interspersed with a specific analytics case study that this event I took advantage of to look into an idea that I didn't really have on my list of things to do at work. But so I want to take you along sort of with the analytics discovery process I went through relative to the election. See what we learned. So one thing that's interesting about our events world, this is logins over all of 2015, is that a lot of the things that really shake our user behavior are not new product launches or an email we sent out or a push notification. We wish, right? Those would all be things that we loved if they were what caused these big spikes. But they're not. They tend to be things that we had nothing to do with and can't control either way, right? So these spikes, what the market is doing, especially if it's associated with a great newsworthy story, right? It's not even really what the market does. I've looked for lots of data on whether it's actually returns, and it's not returns. It's returns that are changing in a way that comes with an exciting story that's getting a lot of coverage. January was rough last year because everyone's excited about their finances at the beginning of the year, and then the market went down for like 3 weeks straight and was 8% down, and everyone's like, never mind, I'm not doing finances this year. So that was an unwelcome start. Tax season, so from March through the middle of April, again, everyone's like, I should figure out what my financial scene is. I'm gonna look into Betterment. So you see like a 6-week elevated period, right, where people are into Betterment. Then nobody does anything in the summer, and then Brexit happens, and then the Fed decides not to change interest rates, and then finally our case study today or tonight, the election. Right? So those are the kinds of things that move the needle for us, way more than the stuff that we try to drive. So I probably don't have to refresh everyone's memory on the election, but you probably remember some version of feeling like one of these lines, right? Which was riding high or low, and then right about 9 p.m., really reevaluating the world and figuring out what it looked like instead. So this time series is sort of the basis for the analysis, right? We had a stable view of the world until about 8 p.m. The market closes at 4:30, for reference. And then by about midnight, we had a whole new view of the world, right? And as those 6 or 8 hours where everyone was sort of figuring out what they were gonna, how they reinterpreted what they knew about the world. So you can ask questions about how that made investors feel without looking at Betterment data, because we have data about the stock markets more generally, right? So this is what S&P futures did over that night. So the futures market, the regular stock market isn't open overnight, but you can trade basically derivatives of the S&P 500 in the aftermarket hours, and we have that data. So market closes at 4 p.m. Nothing changes. This is scaled just to like where the market started at noon. Everything's fine. You see this little bump right at 7:30. That's the polls start to close. Maybe people are getting excited, and then the polls close in a way that is not what people were expecting, and all of a sudden the futures market starts diving, right? And so between that about 8 p.m. and midnight, it actually went down as fast as it could and hit what's called a limit down. So the futures market has a rule that once you've dropped 5%, everyone should cool down for a little while and not trade anymore. And so it hit that line. It hit the most that you can lose in that short period of time. And then, that's weird, it undid all of that before the markets opened in the morning. Right? So we actually had our response team ready for this major event, just so that on this Wednesday morning, Betterment will be ready to answer any customer questions, right? We sort of staff up our customer service. We have notifications ready to send out. We're ready to sort of handle anything that people are feeling nervous about. And then the market opened at the same thing it closed at the day before. And we were like, wait, so was this a thing or not? Did this happen? Is anyone scared? And so the rest of the data sort of tells that story. So I superimposed, this is not the most data science-y thing I've ever done, but I superimposed the one graph on the other. I stretched it so that the timescales are the same. And isn't that uncanny? So people always say that markets don't really care what's going to happen in the world. Markets care about uncertainty, right? And so this period between 6 p.m. or between 8 p.m. and midnight was when the blue and red lines were moving, right? Is when we were realizing that what's going to happen is not what we expected. That's the period during which the market was saying, uncertainty is the worst, sell, sell, sell. We don't want to be around for this future world we haven't thought about that much yet. And then our expectations stabilize around midnight. Now we know what's going to happen. And the market says, never mind. It's still going to, right? The economy is going to be what it's going to be. And so came back to normal. And so the question is, what did Betterment customers do over that same time period? What can we learn about what affects them so that the motivating reason for this is what I thought it would be interesting and interesting for us to talk about. But we're trying to figure out how to give each customer that we haven't always met personally the information, the nudges, the signals here and there that will make them most successful. And most successful in this case probably doesn't mean selling your whole portfolio at 8 p.m. and buying it again the next morning, right? That's probably what we want to keep people from doing if they're inclined to do so. So this is Mixpanel data, or this is our user event data. I have a lot of graphs of this format, so I'll just make sure we know what we're looking at. That gray period is the same gray period from the previous graph, this period of uncertainty. The dotted line is our like trailing month normal volume, right? So that's based on all our historical data before anything crazy was going on. As if the month before the night of the election wasn't also a crazy month, but less crazy specifically. And then that black line is the login volume that we actually observed during this 3-day period. The y-axis is percent of customers logging in each half-hour block. So one thing that I want to sort of disclaimer about this, a lot of the times people are worried that with a robo-advisor, because you don't have someone to call necessarily, which is not true, we have plenty of people ready to answer the phone, but because you can't go knock on your advisor's door, which is sort of like the antiquated notion of what people do with their money, that people will be unprepared or will not have some sort of comforting situation to go when they get nervous. And so we see in a lot of these graphs a big spike, right? So from the dotted line up to the peak of that actual line, you see like a 3 or 4x spike in people logging in on Wednesday morning. And that's a big deal, right? We would notice that in any sort of model we were doing. The other thing to notice is the y-axis. So that is, well, I committed a data science error where I said percent, but then also didn't multiply by 100. That's between 1 and 2, up to 3% of customers that are logging in those half-hour periods. This is not every customer going crazy, right? There are a segment of our customers who are super engaged with following finances and stuff. Most of our customers didn't know what was happening in the market, right? And that's good for them, and we're happy for them. But these customers, so it's 3 times, 4 times as many as normal, still leaves 97% of our customers worrying about walking the dog and getting coffee in the morning, right? So it's interesting to show how these behaviors change, but I don't want to give anyone the false impression that there was like a run on the bank this morning. So we see this big spike. Well, that's one thing. So people are logging in. They want to know what their account looks like, make sure all the money's still there and everything. That's not necessarily bad, right? People need to get their information. What we worry about is people doing things that will harm their investing future, right? Harm their livelihood. Allocation changes could be that thing. So an allocation change is, say you have your retirement portfolio set at 90% stocks. An allocation change is the tool we give you to change how much risk or what you're invested in. So you can drag that allocation change slider from 90% all the way down to 0, and you will sell all your stocks and buy bonds instead. Now that's great if you're about to buy your house in a month and you need to sort of take out the volatility and keep the money you've got. It's not great if you're using it as a tool to predict what happens next in the stock market. We have other research that shows that the more often you hit that knob, the more you underperform what your portfolio was going to do by itself. So on average, people time that wrong, which is not just a Betterment experience. There's all kinds of crazy mutual fund studies about people doing the exact same thing. So we see an even bigger spike here on a relative level of how many people are doing this. What's interesting is the login spike was in the morning. The allocation change spike is at midnight. These are the people who are following it minute by minute, and they are on the game, and they things settled out at midnight, and they're like, I know what I'm going to do. And so they made that big change. We see another spike in the morning for the people who are like, I care a lot, but not enough to be up in the middle of the night doing this. OK, so that's great. We know that we can measure important things like this, our users taking these big actions. We always could have done that, except for half the time we had a bunch of stuff instrumented that we didn't care about, and a bunch of other stuff that we were like, oh man, I wish, that's a good point. We would really like to know that now, but we forgot to wire that up. Our best practice number one, our 3 best practices in the talk today, is tracking plans. It is a relatively low-tech solution to this organizational problem of prompting a discussion about what we care about before we wire it up, before the thing happens, right? So we have a shared Google Drive folder of spreadsheets, and we ask everybody these questions when they're working in a new domain. What are we tracking? Why do we think that's important to track? What are we going to call it? What properties will it have, and what kind of values are we putting in those properties? It's not that fancy, right? Everyone who's done any of this has encountered those questions and sort of probably presumes that they've thought about them. What we've found is, A, an ounce of planning is worth pounds of post hoc figuring out. Usually you can piece things back together and figure it out if you didn't do it, but boy, does that take a lot longer than having the thing that you wish you had. And that this planning moment, because we've made it part of our procedure, part of how we get this work done, is this amazing opportunity to have a conversation between analytics, the product manager, and the engineers implementing it to actually catch all of those miscommunications about what we mean to track, what we want that event to measure, where we're implementing it, right? Is this implemented server-side so that we get the transactional record? Is it implemented on the button click, right? If you just say, user did a thing, those things aren't clear. And just taking that moment to have that conversation has been invaluable to us. And also an understanding of purpose and expectations. Will we be able to ask this question later? A lot of the times, the non-analytics sort of view on this by default is, we throw an event on there, you'll be able to tell me why people did that. And like maybe if we set ourselves up for success on that, and we have that conversation, we have that strategy, we'll be able to do that. But this is the time to have that conversation. But also, don't try to play in the whole universe at once. Don't sit down and say, for our company of 200 people, we're going to write down all the properties and all the values that every property can take, right? Because that's, it's a boil the ocean approach. You just will never get it done, and you'll never get that organizational change. So the way we've approached it is, each new project that gets on the quarterly planning cycle deserves one of these conversations when you're about to start doing it, right? So we can do it chunk by chunk, and we can improve the quality of our whole universe in manageable pieces when people are already motivated to work on that code, right? So we take that opportunity. If you're going to re-engineer the rollover initiation process, we're also going to clean up that world of event tracking. All right. So now we all know to do tracking plans, and we're back to our login rates question. So I said that this user behavior changed dramatically as a result of the election. We're presuming that that's based on some sort of like view about the future that's probably politically related, right? But we haven't shown that in any way, right? We don't have a people property for political inclination. So what can we do? Well, one thing that's interesting is that we have, after the election is over, we know the percentage of people who voted for each party in every county in the United States. That's as granular as it gets. That's as granular as it's reported. And this is crying out for a cartogram, right? That's not the distribution of the country as it is visually. But how can we use that to ask more detailed questions about why people were taking these actions and how we might help them do some things more rationally? What we do have is all of our customers' zip codes. Because we're a financial services company, they have to give us a real address, and we know for real it's the right address. So we can map zip codes to counties. It's a little bit of a fuzzy data science thing. The post office didn't actually ask all the municipalities when they drew those lines, so they're not the same. But there are good databases that will let you pretty much match it up. We go from those counties to the vote shares that we got from, also not something that's widely available. There's no federal agency of listing all of the vote shares by counties, right? I got that from a CSV in somebody's GitHub that some journalist put together. I'm very thankful. And so we go from those counties to the vote share. These are the 4 counties I've lived in as an adult. I've never lived anywhere that voted less than 59%. Maybe I should get out there to more of the country. OK, so now the idea is for each customer, we have a notion not of their political beliefs necessarily, right? And I don't want to misconstrue that we are judging anyone's political belief or know anything about it. But if you live in a county that's 82% Democratic, you probably, right, have a view of the market or of the future that reflects that to some degree, right? Or maybe. It's sort of an empirical question. That's why I was curious to see if we could find any differences in behavior as a result of that. So this is the same logins graph, broken down by whether you live in a county or whether you gave us an address in a county that's 55% one way or the other or greater, whether you're in one of those rare, nicely mixed, evenly distributed communities. And first result is no, not really. Where you live, whether you live in a red county or a blue county, you're still pretty interested in what happened to your finances the next morning, right? That's not a partisan issue. That's just everybody being curious about how much money they have left. What about allocation changes? Are you more likely to be one of those reactive investors if you live in a red county or a blue county? No, not particularly. This is smaller. This is a smaller sample, right? So we go up to 60-minute chunks to get a little bit less noise. But it still looks like remarkably similar. I was actually really surprised to see that this kind of behavior is not conditioned on where you live or what I presume your political beliefs to be. One thing that we did was drive traffic. So from the app that morning, and I think on our website, maybe we tweeted it probably, we drove traffic to this article we wrote about why the election shouldn't be a thing you should care about and why you should keep doing the things you were doing. We can also look at, so this is what we call an experience event, not a business event, but did people end up reading this article? This is the cumulative percentage of customers who read that article by where they lived. So we do see the people who live in Democratic counties coming out, reading, or it's not a big difference when you think about how many customers it is, but there were more of them showing up to read the article. What's interesting is it's almost all in the first 6 hours, right? That gap opens up immediately that morning when I think maybe if you want to tell a psychological story about it, the Democratic crowd was like, what happened? I need information to understand my world now. But then a couple of days later when things had settled, it was equally interesting to both crowds. I thought that was just a fun curiosity. Okay, so we know a little bit more about it. No earth-shattering revelations there. And so we'll go back to some business events to keep us entertained. The second thing we did that made this problem more manageable and that gave us the ability to sort of get where we wanted to be with our event tracking is to separate all of our user events into two classes. We call those business events and experience events. So some examples are of business events: sign up completed and deposit created. Those are things that have sort of database analogs, right, in our data warehouse. They are material things that change the relationship between the customer and Betterment. They're things that usually have a dollar value associated with them or some other sort of material goal. Things in the business events column can be a team's goal, right? They can be somebody's OKR. Things in the experience events, element clicked, element view, page visited, these describe the customer's interaction with the UI, right? It tells the story of how they got from customer signed up to customer created initial deposit, right? It tells the flow between those business events. Experience events cannot be someone's goal, right? A team's goal cannot be to drive more clicks on something because then you just give more things for them to click on, right? A team's goal is to drive a business event, and the experience events are there for them to understand why that changed. This is a great use of the signal model, right? We want to know the business events, and we want to know which things got people there. So that's sort of how we think about those. So what that maps to is that process-wise, I am watching carefully all of the business events, and if anyone changes one in a way that I don't like, I try to intervene and ask why. Maybe that's the right way to frame it. I ask. And I say, oh, well, we designed that to represent these ideas, and I think we want to keep that as standard and stable as possible. If you want to implement more experience events to tell your story about what's going on and what people are clicking on and seeing, go for it, right? Do as many or as few of those as you want. Meet the needs of that team. And so what we learned here is global micromanagement is not fun or sustainable. That if the question is, or if the plan is tag me in every PR that involves a tracking event, nobody gets their job done, and I'm not happy. But that total laissez-faire on this whole world was not working for us, right? That we need someone to have a central perspective and to have the best interests of the whole system in mind. So by defining two classes and being clear about what standards apply to each, We get the high reliability tracking of these things that we know we all care about and that should be interpreted the same way by different people. And we get the high flexibility of tracking customers' experiences to reflect the needs of each of those teams. Okay, so back to our story on election night. This is the basic interface for making an allocation change. What's interesting going on here is that you start at an allocation, right? Today you are invested at a certain allocation, and you're going to move from that to a new allocation. So each one of these actions has sort of two values, and the change can be expressed as a market expectation. Generally, if you go from 90% stocks to 10% stocks, you are expecting the stock market to do poorly, right? Or at least that would be the rational thing to do. We actually ask people in some interfaces why they're making the action, and it is not universally true that that's what's motivating people. Sometimes people have the opposite expectation and action. But that's the general interpretation. So the question is, we know that people in all parts of the country are making this decision about the same amount to make a change, but are they changing in the same way? So again, here's what the broader stock market did. For the first 6 hours, it was all down, right? All from stocks, out of stocks. In this world, it was probably selling out of stocks into cash. In our world, it would be selling out of stocks and into bonds. So what happened in our world? You can see that pretty well. I was worried about that one. In this period, each of these dots is a customer making a change, right? And the point is where the customer went to. The line shows where they went from. And so you can see right at November 9th at midnight, you can see this big weight down. That's people moving out of stocks and into a more conservative bonds portfolio. And then you can see the next day and the days after, as the market's going back up, people are chasing that and following that back up. The y-axis here is the change from where you were to where you're going to be. So 0 would be no change. There can't be any dots there. So anybody want to eyeball it and say what the pattern is? Now, obviously, these are nominal, right? So there are more people living in democratic areas in our customer base. So we need to do some smoothing here and average that out and sort of figure out what the trend is. And here's our big difference of the study. And maybe the first time you look at this graph, you don't say, whoa, that's shockingly different. Generally, our customers in these two areas did the same thing that everyone else did in the stock market. Again, not all of our customers, the 2 or 3% of people who did anything, did follow the same pattern that the rest of the stock market did, which is run away for 12 hours and then come back in the next morning. What's interesting is this statistically significant bump at 8 o'clock, or at 6 o'clock, right when polls were closing, that same bump we saw in the market, people in Democratic counties were actually moving into stocks when they said, polls are closed, everything went pretty well, this country's going great, right? While at the same time, the average person from Republican County was moving the other way, right? They were moving down. The red line is below 0 starting earlier in the day, right? Democrats stay optimistic for longer, right? And then by midnight, you see both groups are basically not significantly different, moving out of stocks as fast as they can, again, assuming that they moved at all. Then the whole way back, you see the people from Republican counties moving back into stocks earlier than the people from Democratic areas did. It doesn't look like a huge difference, right? But when you look at the difference between those lines, if you're someone who's into timing the market, which is essentially what this is, the people from Democratic areas at noon the next day were still on average moving out of stocks, right? The market was already back up 2% by then. Right? It wasn't until the next day or into the next day that both groups are all the way in. If you're into this view of like market strategy, this would be a huge difference, right? Again, we're saying both of these customers shouldn't be doing either of these things. But interesting to see that we have evidence that your political beliefs did actually influence the specific investment decisions that you made, not just the volume of being involved. So that's the punchline. Our third best practice is automated data QA. This is a YAML file that the analytics team owns. This is a snippet of it, which shows 4 different classes of events for our business events. We have default tests that we run to ask, is all the data that we're seeing coming in each day meeting our expectations for what data should be populated, what values it should have? You can see that every business event we expect to be able to figure out from our anonymous world or what is potentially anonymous world of user event traffic, that we can map that. We can join that with those properties back to our actual user identities, right? If we have a bunch of people who we can identify, something's definitely wrong in the tracking code, right? And so what we do is we define these tests in YAML so that it's clear to everybody what we expect to happen. We write the tests in R because it's our team that's sort of owning this process, and that's what we use. And then we run these tests nightly against the previous 24 hours of events. So we say, dump every event that we fired yesterday and run all of these tests against it. And in the morning, I get a nicely formatted Slack message that says, you should probably go bother these people who forgot to fill in user ID or forgot to fill in broker-dealer transaction ID, right? We have a lot of our event tracking that should tie in a very material way to stuff that we're measuring that ends up being dollars on the board at the end of the day, right? And we want to make sure, we want to assert that this data is of the same quality and can be used to make sort of the same caliber of decisions as that data is. And we can run this against our stage or production environments. We've changed a little bit, sort of like workflow and what's working for the organization about whether we want to bother everybody about stuff that's wrong in stage, and they say, I know, I'm not done. But we definitely always run it against prod, and sometimes that means we have a day of things that aren't exactly how we like them, but we can go back and clean it up. So lessons we've learned through this process is that being specific, so a meeting where you all say this is what we're going to do feels specific, but it is not technically specific. Being specific like this, like we expect 99% of these events to be able to join to this table, is specific enough that it reduces errors and increases the efficiency, not just the success, but the efficiency of getting to this desired outcome. The test being owned by analytics means that it's not always a blame question, right? It's that we're sort of sharing the responsibility for this working out correctly so that it doesn't start every conversation with, hey, you screwed up how that was implemented. And that having this monitoring means that the organization is more broadly confident that we know all these things are true and accurate about this data. So yeah, it's truth, right? It's truth just in the same way as our transactional data is. So with all of that data that's sort of well instrumented and that we trust, and we have these important questions to ask, the last step is that this sort of like time series historical story about what people did and how they got there is a great way to learn what's going on. To know for sure, we always try to make our questions experimental. Right? So we have a whole in-house A/B testing platform. So we do all of our own assignment and randomization and identity tracking and all that, but all of the outcomes are user events. So we always ask, did somebody in this test complete one of these actions that's from this whole universe of user events? So that project is an in-house tool called Test Track. It's also open source. So if your small company is looking for a Rails-based A/B testing framework, we've got one that we'd love collaboration on. And then all of the assignments and outcomes use the same world. So this is an example of one of the things that we've been able to do to actually show measurable improvements in the decisions that people make. So this is during a previous scary market moment. What we did, these 3 colors are different messages that we sent people. So the thing is with the idea, hey, don't do something bad just because the stock market is doing something, there's a lot of good reasons not to do that, right? There's a lot of different ways you could communicate that to people. And ideally, we communicate using the language and the information that's most effective for customers generally, and then ideally for you specifically, right? We want to talk to you the way that's effective for you. So we had messages, don't worry about the market, what should I do, right? So more action-oriented, or why am I losing? Explain to me my fear. And we showed a simple summary of this chart. The 4th group there, the any negative action, so that groups together things like making an allocation change, making a withdrawal, or leaving entirely. Those are all sure ways to not meet your retirement goals. That these messages collectively reduced the rate of people doing that by 2%. And that there was some learning to be had about which messages were more effective for which things, although not really powered well enough to be the end of that discussion. In summary, I think I'm really proud. I know that we're excited that Betterment and really the rest of the fintech community has brought this kind of product development and this kind of technology development to the financial services space. Because financial services is such a structured world, it's kind of easy to know what kind of product to build, right? You build the product that moves the money from here to here and stays in bounds with all of the ways that the regulators have told you that you have to do that. It hadn't been a world where people would ask, what should the user experience be like to accomplish this goal? What do the customers need? And that's central to our experience and to our product, right? So bringing that into the financial services world hopefully makes a lot more people successful and happy with their financial experience. The election and other of these major events are prime opportunities for us to test whether we can even understand what people are doing, right? Our whole premise is that like we can help you meet your goals. Well, that's only true if we can actually figure out what you're doing and why. And so these big watershed moments where everyone reacts, or some people do, are our opportunities to learn more about you and to figure out how to help you more in the future. And that investing in this discipline, this event tracking discipline, has allowed for higher quality interpretation and faster progress learning these things to empower our customers to do what's best for their money. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Okay, so we want to open it up for Q&A. So if anyone has any questions for Sam, we have a few on Twitter as well.
Wow.
Great. Awesome. You impressed them. So one question that we got from Twitter is about a North Star metric. A lot of startups, a lot of companies have this one key metric that they really focus on. So this person wanted to know more about what that is for Betterment and how you came up with deciding on that one key KPI.
Sure. So we have super ambitious growth goals right now. I would call them even maybe mandates if you ask the founder. And so, there's a lot of things going on in the app, but really what we need to focus on and make sure we do the best job of is growing. So we need to be much bigger, much sooner than we would be if we just coasted. And so the sign up and onboarding funnel, those conversion rates are one of our biggest topics. One thing that we try really hard to do is conversion rates for specific groups of people that we're trying to target and try to understand and serve better. There's a lot of analytics going on in there, so conversion rate for a target customer is a great idea, except for that you don't know if they're a target customer or not until you've met them a little bit better. And so that's a lot of those challenges we work in a lot. But basically, getting people from that first touch all the way in through funding their account. So we don't call it a successful conversion until they've funded their account, because that's when we become their financial manager, and that's when they're likely to stick around.
Great. Do we have any other questions in the audience? Great. Hold on.
Thanks. So you said that the analytics team owns the testing specs, essentially. Did they approach the product team with that, or how did that kind of go down, and how did it play out? It
was sort of when we didn't have our act together, it was a mutual frustration, right? And it ended up feeling like I couldn't do my job because people would have very reasonable questions around things that we had data on, and I couldn't give a confident answer. So we were sort of motivated to be the central force in cleaning it up. It's also easier for us to coordinate because we're sort of the nexus of all the people who are dealing with this data and asking these questions. But obviously, it's, you don't want to be heavy-handed. Nothing's really sort of mandatory except for that you have to write down when a business event happened. But yeah, in terms of what the tests are, it's really just if we agree this is the shape of describing this action, we need to make sure we get all that. But yeah, I would say it's primarily motivated by wanting to be able to answer questions that felt fair and reasonable from those stakeholders.